I take it. Hello, my name is Jan Ruzicka, and I am from Aberystwyth. I am very glad to be here. Thank you for the invitation to the organizers. Thanks to Ayla and Ken for all the work on the ground. We have a panel on the, basically, if I understand it correctly, implications of the war in Ukraine for the nuclear world order, broadly speaking. And that brings me to the three people who are going to be speaking. Our keynote will be delivered by Nick Ritchie from York University, or is it the University of York? Oh, well, there we are, the University of York. So he's almost on the home turf, but he tells me that this is his first time at York St. John's University. So our keynote will be delivered by Nick Ritchie from York University. And then we will have the pleasure of hearing reactions and questions and probing of what Nick says from Laura Considine, who is our keynote will be delivered by Nick Ritchie, Associate Professor.
Ukraine and its nuclear threats have generated fear of nuclear war in Europe for the first time in a long time, first time in decades, really. And I'm going to frame my remarks today in terms of the continuing contestation about what nuclear weapons mean in world politics and how the nuclear dimensions of the Ukraine war then fit into that. So my opening then is that the global politics of nuclear weapons is, broadly speaking, about a fundamental contestation between nuclearism on the one hand and anti-nuclearism on the other. And these are two incommensurable nuclear worldviews that have got very different things to say about what constitutes the nuclear world. And it's a contestation in which nuclearism is hegemonic in the centers of power in world politics, and anti-nuclearism has a much more subaltern status. So briefly then, nuclearism constructs a world in which nuclear weapons are a permanent necessity to deter aggression in a largely static, realist reading of the interstate system. Nuclear weapons are culturally embedded as legitimate and highly valued assets. Nuclearism tends to frame a nuclear-armed world as something that is sustainable, because nuclear deterrence can be relied upon to manage conflicts and prevent nuclear war indefinitely, whilst also normalizing the possibility for and the planning for fighting an actual nuclear war. In doing so, this generates continuing requirements for massive investment in nuclear weapons, and this then embeds nuclearism in material forms, in networks, and in institutions. I think the last thing really that nuclearism does is that it reduces the question of nuclear disarmament and living in a world without nuclear weapons to either a long-term aspiration or denies its possibility altogether. Now, anti-nuclearism, on the other hand, this constitutes a different worldview of what counts in nuclear politics. And this is one that tends to reflect the experiences of the comparatively weaker, subordinated, disempowered majority of states and peoples. Now, anti-nuclearism frames nuclear weapons as illegitimate, sees nuclearism as an oppressive system, and nuclear disarmament as something that's urgent and necessary based on the unacceptable risk of nuclear violence. And this perspective foregrounds power relations, hierarchy, justice, and marginalization within global nuclear politics, things that are otherwise routinely sidelined. And anti-nuclearism connects this to wider networks and practices of resistance to established power structures in global politics. So that's my kind of framework then, which builds on some work I've done of nuclearism in contestation with anti-nuclearism. Now, what we're seeing then through the Ukraine war is a reproduction and revitalization of nuclearism. That's my key takeaway, really. And this is part of the wider remilitarization of international politics associated with the response to 9/11, the rise of China, a resurgent Russia, and the spread of nationalist populism. Within that, then, we see the wider narrative in the West that the Ukraine war has now normalized is one of what's been called a return to geopolitics. This started to emerge probably about 5 years ago, I think. A return that has encompassed the revaluing and the re-legitimation of nuclear weapons as essential and enduring as far as their advocates are concerned. What we're also seeing, though, is that this cementing now of a full Cold War once again between NATO and Russia, we're seeing that having profound consequences for the other existential challenge that we face by diverting political attention away from addressing the severe ecological crises that are now upon us, as John Kerry warned about, in fact, back in May. So I'll say a few things about how this war is framed by nuclearism, and then how anti-nuclearism appears on the margins of these debates. And I think the war is framed in terms of nuclearism in three ways, which touch on some of the issues and themes that we've explored already in the opening session. So the first is that nuclearism has become very deeply embedded in Russian national identity. And this has found its starkest expression in Russia's so-called nuclear euphoria. And this term has been used by others to refer to a nationalistic celebration almost of Russia's nuclear weapons, particularly since the annexation of Crimea. And we've seen this reflected in increased threat making against NATO states, more spending on nuclear weapons, including some of these exotic and invincible systems, as Putin has called them. We've seen it in massive nuclear exercises, a resumption of nuclear submarine patrols, of bomber patrols that have increasingly infringed national airspaces. So the nuclear aspects of this current phase of the war between Russia and Ukraine are not new. They are just the latest expression of a renuclearization of the East-West relationship, driven in particular by this form of Russian nuclearism, this nuclear euphoria. But I would also add there that this nuclear euphoria is, I think, symptomatic of what's become an almost Manichaean Russian national identity conception, in which NATO has become sort of re-entrenched after the Cold War as the primary threat to Russia, particularly over the last 15 years or so. And now we're seeing, after 2 decades of the war on terror, we're seeing Russia now becoming entrenched as the primary threat to NATO, a shift that I think we can see was formalized in the outcome of the NATO summit in Madrid at the end of last month. So for Moscow, this nuclear euphoria makes sense first within the construction of a Western military and ideological threat that's seen as increasingly implacable and existential for Russia, and can in the end only be deterred by Moscow's threats of nuclear violence. And we're also seeing it through the ways in which renuclearization is part of the reproduction of a counter-hegemonic, pan-Slavic, victimized national identity conception in Russia, and how that's become conflated, particularly with Putin and Putinism. And this came together really, I think, in Putin's television address on February the 24th, when he described very clearly the future of Ukraine as an existential threat to Russia. To quote, "A matter of life and death, a matter of our historical future as a nation. This is not an exaggeration, this is a fact. It is not only a very real threat to our interests, but to the very existence of our state and to its sovereignty," end quote. Now, when Russia's official nuclear doctrine says that the use of nuclear weapons will be justified in response to an attack in which the existence of the country itself is at stake, then this framing of the West and Ukraine and the war really ratchets up both the seriousness of the situation and I think the centrality and the dangers of nuclearism. So that's the first way, really, in which nuclearism frames the war. The second way is through a quite explicit reproduction of the ideas and the practices of nuclear deterrence as a way of trying to set the parameters for what has become essentially a proxy war. Now, Russia was very clear, Putin was very clear, and others in the Russian government back in 2014, that any attempt by NATO forces to undo the annexation of Crimea would risk escalation to a nuclear war. And the same threats, as we know, were made again this year. And they were made in return by NATO leaders to deter any expansion of Russia's military activities to the territory of a NATO state. And at the same time, quite interestingly, we saw some clear statements of a preemptive acceptance of the condition of being deterred, particularly by Biden, who said from the very outset that US forces would not be directly involved in fighting Russian forces in Ukraine for fear of escalation to what Biden called a nuclear World War III. And all of this has reinforced a hegemonic narrative that nuclear deterrence is working, that it can be relied upon to continue working to prevent all-out war, whilst at the same time planning, as we know the Americans have been doing and the Russians have been doing, planning for the possibility of the collapse of nuclear deterrence into actual nuclear use. So we've seen that, but in the context of nuclear deterrence, at the same time, and we saw this in periods of the Cold War too, the idea that Russian nuclear threats should prevent more direct Western military intervention has been deeply frustrating to many in Europe and the US, and it's been actively resisted. In particular, we've seen widespread calls for a no-fly zone based on the legitimacy of stopping Russia's aerial pulverization of Ukraine. And that's come with reassurances given that any escalation that might induce can be controlled because of a shared fear of escalation getting out of control. Now, on this occasion, the Biden administration disagreed again and said that a no-fly zone would be too risky. But next time it might not. And convincing yourself that you know in contexts like this, the other's red lines, and that you can push right up to or even cross those red lines whilst managing escalation based on some common understanding of deterrence and control, that's a big bet to place. But nonetheless, there are quite a few willing gamblers in this nuclear casino, I think. This leads then to the third and the final way in which the conflict is framed by nuclearism. And that's the way in which Russian nuclearism and Russia's nuclear threats have been delegitimized as irresponsible, dangerous, cavalier, all those sorts of terms, particularly in Europe and the US, which of course they are, right? They are irresponsible, dangerous, cavalier. But here, what we see is the moral illegitimacy of these threats is framed as a distinctly Russian problem. Its nuclear threats are unacceptable because of the type of state Russia is under Putin: irresponsible, barbaric, predatory, rogue, and so on. And this tends to then reproduce a familiar narrative of Western nuclear exceptionalism that in contrast then frames Western nuclear weapons and threats as somehow legitimate, responsible, upholding of the global public good of a liberal international order, and so on. This is problematic because doing coercive diplomacy through threats of nuclear violence has been a standard practice, a standard script of the nuclear age, both to maintain and to challenge a status quo. And the US and the UK have issued plenty of such threats, as of course as Russia. And a case in point, I think, is the threat made by the UK to Iraq in 2003 by UK Defence Secretary Jeff Hoon, who said the UK reserved the right to use nuclear weapons in response to a chemical or biological attack, and would absolutely use them in the right circumstances. So this threat to Iraq wasn't even about deterring a third party from intervening. This was about deterring the attacked state itself from responding with chemical or biological weapons. So I'll say there are three ways in which the conflict is framed by nuclearism. Through Russia's nuclear euphoria as a symptom of this Manichaean identity conception in relation to NATO, through the reproduction of nuclear deterrence as a way to try and manage and shape the parameters of this conflict whilst planning for its breakdown, and with ongoing resistance to the self-restraint that nuclear deterrent threats are seen to impose. And then through a more specific delegitimation of Russian nuclearism that reproduces then a Western nuclear exceptionalism. I'll just say a few things about where anti-nuclearism then appears at the margins and how it features in the discourses of the war. Like I say, at the margins of power in world politics. And there are a couple of ways in which it does this. First, in terms of pervasive and valid concerns about the efficacy of doing nuclear deterrence in practice, all of which pivots off lots of established work on misperception, accidents, pressures to escalate, the role of luck in nuclear crises, and the capacity for crises to rapidly escalate out of control. And at root here is a fairly familiar contestation around the extent to which the actual risk of nuclear violence in a crisis like this can be known and then can be successfully manipulated through escalation for political wins. And the historiography of the Cuban Missile Crisis has shown us that certainties at the time about what would happen if the US or the Soviet Union did X or Y turned out to be very dangerously misguided. And these concerns were expressed in relation to the current war at the first meeting of the states parties to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons in Vienna a couple of weeks ago in mid-June. And within this sort of critique, I suppose, of nuclear deterrence, the political work that nuclear deterrence is meant to be doing here is also challenged. And it's challenged by the idea that without nuclear weapons, NATO would have entered this war directly and started killing Russian soldiers en masse. Now, it may well have done, but there are also good reasons why NATO leaders do not want a major escalation to an all-out conventional war with Russia, especially with Biden having finally and very badly gotten the US out of Afghanistan last August after 20 years of the long war there. So it's legitimate to ask in this context, what the added deterrent value of nuclear threats really is, both for NATO and Russia. The second way in which anti-nuclearism appears is through the ways in which this illegitimacy of Russia's nuclear threats is framed much more as a symptom of an international security system that's rooted in nuclearism. So here, Russian nuclear threats are the latest example of a systemic problem, not an exclusively Russian problem. There's nothing particularly novel about Russia's nuclear threats, because threats like these are the regular output of a system of state security that ultimately rests on the threat of nuclear omnicide. So the focus here has been on the illegitimacy of all nuclear threats because of the unacceptable humanitarian and ecological consequences of nuclear violence and the risk of nuclear detonation so long as the weapons exist. And this was also all reiterated repeatedly at the first meeting of states parties of the TPNW. Now, it goes without saying that Ukraine has got, of course, a right not to be attacked, and NATO states are right to support its resistance to Russian aggression. But Russia is acting now, as the US and Soviet Union did repeatedly throughout the Cold War, as great irresponsibles, as Hedley Bull called them, enabled by nuclear weaponry and by a culture of militarism and nuclearism. And this is compounded by the dangers of concentrating omnicidal power in a single person at the top of a nuclear use authority chain, whether that be Putin or Trump or Modi or Johnson. And I think what's been interesting here has been the way that some states and NGOs articulating what I would call an anti-nuclearist discourse have argued that Putin's action has shown us again that those who rise to positions of the highest authority are capable really of extraordinary miscalculation, which I think describes what Putin has done. And when you read that across into the capacity for nuclear omnicide, becomes deeply worrying. The third way in which anti-nuclearism features is by showing us once again the ways in which current nuclear narratives are shot through with gendered language of strength and resolve to face down implacable foes in a conflict that's dominated by white men and the masculine rationalities in the discourse of nuclear deterrence. And the gendered and the raced impacts of the conflict have also been highlighted through the ways in which women and children are bearing the brunt of the violence, and through the ways in which millions in the non-white, non-West are now at risk of starvation as the global food crisis that's been fueled by global heating, the effects of COVID, but now also the escalating costs of food and fuel and fertilizer across Africa and the Middle East, driven by the war in Ukraine, the scale of which will increase enormously if nuclear weapons are used in this conflict. Finally, anti-nuclearism also comprises a much broader set of perspectives on nuclear weapons and the war, notably from across the global South. And these tend to center more on questions of nuclear justice and inequality, often in the context of their colonial histories. And here we see that the scale of the opposition to Russian aggression has been a mainly Western rather than a global affair. And this has been explained variously in terms of some sympathy for Russia's pushback against perceived US and Western hegemony, again, rooted in histories of Western colonialism, Soviet support for independence, movements across part of the global South, and so on. Here we've seen a Western framing of the conflict in terms of a dichotomy between authoritarianism versus democracy as something that's been treated with skepticism. Western hypocrisy has been noted in condemning Russian aggression in Ukraine, but not US and UK aggression in Iraq or Saudi aggression in Yemen, as well as the history of the collective punishment of Western sanctions in parts of the global South of the type now being experienced by Russia. And also what's been noted here has been the racist treatment of non-white refugees from the Ukraine conflict compared to the treatment of refugees from other countries, and an embrace by Europe of white refugees from the Ukraine conflict compared to, again, the treatment of non-white refugees from Syria, Afghanistan, and other conflicts in North Africa and the Middle East, in which the US is, the US and other Western states are implicated. As a result of all these things, really, I think what we've seen is this widespread neutrality across much of South America, Africa, Asia, and a revisiting and perhaps almost a reinvigoration, I guess time will tell on this, but certainly a revisiting of the idea of non-alignment that we see manifest in the reluctance of some states to condemn Russia and a reluctance to condemn Moscow's nuclear threats as well, from states that are at the same time articulating an anti-nuclearist discourse, which I think is interesting and speaks to interpretations of the power dynamics at play in this conflict. So what does this mean then? Set out some ways in which nuclearism is contextualizing this conflict, and a couple of ways in which anti-nuclearism is appearing on the margins. I'll finish by offering a couple of reflections and then look forward to what Jan and Nick and Laura have got to say. The first of these is that I think there's little that's new in this war in terms of the politics of nuclear weapons. I think many of the nuclear weapons issues that have been framed as novel somehow in this conflict have been identified and studied and debated over the past 75 years or so of the nuclear age. I think rather than novelty, what this current situation is doing is crystallizing freshly, crystallizing anew what it means to live in a nuclear armed world. And it's reproduced established systems of meaning about nuclear weapons and their contestations. Now, that said, perhaps there is something dangerously novel in economically squeezing a paranoid nuclear superpower that's fighting a major war, that's tied up in narratives of vital interests and core identity for the country and for the leadership personally. Perhaps that's the novel aspect of this. My second reflection is that because of the indeterminacy of nuclear deterrence in practice, we don't know, and I'd be interested to know what Lauren and Jan and Nick think about this, but I think that we don't know, and we cannot say in advance that we do, that nuclear deterrence is working or that it isn't working. We can't say that it will work over the course of this crisis or that it won't work, that escalation will or won't lead to nuclear war, and that a non-nuclear outcome is or isn't the result of nuclear deterrence working as intended when intended. And yet the dominant narrative insists or assumes that we can say very concrete things in support of nuclear deterrence. My third reflection is that despite the resurgence of nuclearism and militarism, the Ukraine war has demonstrated really quite vividly the diminishing returns to violence, especially for Putin, for whom the returns have been almost entirely, and I think unexpectedly for him, negative. But we see this also in terms of the limits on what nuclear weapons can do. They have not aided Russia in its quest to take Ukraine, just as they didn't aid the US in its quest to subdue Iraq. Nuclear weapons have not stopped Russian aggression. They cannot win the war for Russia. They're only potentially useful in preventing all-out war between states, including nuclear warfare, whilst also incentivizing risk-taking that could lead to that very outcome. So in the end then, I think we're still left with this familiar contestation between nuclearism and anti-nuclearism, one in which nuclearism remains very deeply embedded as an ideology, as a structure of power in nuclear armed states, national politics, and in world politics. It is subject to anti-nuclearist resistances. This has been re-energized and advanced through the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons and its development over the past decade or so, and now by fears of nuclear war in Ukraine. And so I think a central question for me, at least to end with, is whether anti-nuclearism can make any progress in dislodging this hegemonic nuclearism. And my perhaps somewhat optimistic answer is maybe, because as Robert Cox observed, someone whose work I've drawn on a lot in terms of an understanding of structural power and hegemony, as Cox observed, ontology is central to the contestation between hegemony and counter-hegemony, so that a shift of ontologies or a shift in worldviews, and for me, nuclear worldviews, that shift is inherent, to quote Cox, inherent in the very process of historical structural change, end quote. I'll leave it there for my remarks. Thanks.
Great, thanks very much, Nick. Laura.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much to the organizers and to Ken for inviting me. And thank you to Nick as well for giving us something that had so much with which we could engage in our comments. And we've read the piece that he's discussed today. And I actually was left in a bit of a problem because there was so much there. I wasn't sure what aspect that I should engage with. And I've actually decided to think a little bit more about this idea of competing ontologies and what this means for Russia. But I'd be happy also in the discussion to talk about more some of the specifics. So I think Nick really sets out an important analysis of nuclear politics as this realm of two competing incommensurable nuclear ontologies that are in this hegemonic counter-hegemonic context. I think this is really important and incredibly useful to think about the operation of nuclear politics and how we can see this in Russia and Ukraine today. However, I also think that it's useful to question why the politics of nuclear weapons has formed this binary, and what are the implications of this for how we think about and practice nuclear politics. I think that this form of nuclear politics that Nick kind of so clearly related to Russia's invasion and nuclear threats is a reaction to what Ritchie Abraham has called the fundamental ambivalence of nuclear technology. So Abraham argues that ambivalence, as the simultaneous existence of multiple meanings in nuclear practices, is a permanent feature of nuclear technology, and that we cannot control the meaning of nuclear events. Nuclear technology brought deep uncertainty and ambivalence to the world. The technology has radical implications, but its outcomes cannot be fixed. So we manage this ambivalence of the splitting of the atom through a discursive division. Nuclear discourse, as Abraham argues, is internally split between binaries of salvation and apocalypse, nuclearism, anti-nuclearism, civil and military, and sex and death, as Carol Cohen famously stated in her 1987 article. This ambivalence of nuclear technology can be seen in multiple ways. So Abraham writes about how highly nationalistic projects to generate nuclear power were also actually multinational in practice. He writes about the in practice overlap between civil and nuclear programs, how civilian reactors were used to build nuclear powered naval submarines, and how waste was used across civil and military programs. So he says that, I'm quoting here, the line between the civilian and the military, exclusive and common, national and international, progressive and dangerous, has been transgressed repeatedly from the beginning of the atomic age and up until the present. I think that this can also be seen in how often we talk of paradoxes in nuclear strategy and scholarship. John Hertz, in a key early work on nuclear politics, wrote of the new global reality of simultaneous extreme power and extreme vulnerability. Nuclear weapons themselves bring these contradictions and paradoxes to the world. And Nick mentioned as well that the idea of the indeterminacy of nuclear deterrence, and I completely agree with him on this. So I think that this nuclearism, anti-nuclearism form of nuclear politics, as this contest of ontologies, is actually an expression of this fundamental ambivalence. In a way, both are sides of the same coin, as providing ways of discursively settling the ambiguities of nuclear technology and bringing certainty where there is none, whether this is through deterrence or abolition. Nuclear politics takes this form as an attempt to resolve the fundamental ambivalence of nuclear technology and the uncertainty it creates. But this contest is, as such, unending, as the inherent ambivalence cannot be resolved. So all this is quite abstract, but I think it matters because what this form of nuclear politics has meant is that we can't get anywhere. We move through cycles of contestation interspersed with crises, the Russian threats being the most recent example. And this is where I agree with Nick in that while what we have here is extremely concerning, I was personally scared at the time when these threats were being made. I had texts from concerned family and friends who really hadn't ever been interested in what I did before, and all of a sudden wanted to know, was there going to be a nuclear war? To which I answered, I don't know. So it is deeply concerning, but it's not new. And I don't actually see where we can go from here while still locked within this cycle of nuclear weapons politics as repetition of nuclearism, anti-nuclearism, because both sides will take exactly the opposite lessons from this. You can find, if you want, arguments in this situation for more or for fewer nuclear weapons. And I don't position myself as outside of this cycle from some neutral vantage point. I have a clear position that more nuclear weapons do not make us safer. I was thinking recently that the arguments for more nuclear weapons mirrors very much the arguments brought up against gun control in the United States every time there's another shooting, and which seems constant at the moment, that guns don't kill people, people do. And the way to stop a bad guy with a gun is to have a good guy with a gun. So the way to stop a bad guy with a nuclear weapon is to have a good guy with a nuclear weapon. And this is, a reaction, a common reaction to Putin's nuclear threats. Neither of these arguments make sense to me. But I think that my overall point is that in answer to the topic of the roundtable of thinking about nuclear weapons after Putin's war, I think it is pretty much the same as nuclear weapons before Putin's war, and will continue to be so unless we can dedicate ourselves somehow to thinking beyond the boundaries of this structure of nuclear politics.
Okay, thanks, Laura. Nick. Professor Lewis, you've got about 25 different windows.
That would be good.
No, should it? Okay, Nick,
Thanks.
say 1, 2, 3.
1, 2, 3. Great, thank you. I'd like to begin as well by thanking the organizers and Ken for inviting me to be on this panel. It's great to be here. I want to start by thanking Nick for a terrific paper. Like Laura, I agree with a lot of it, but not all of it. But it's a really thought-provoking piece, and I just enjoyed Laura's comments greatly. And I'll try to think about ways now that I can try and bring your comments into what I'm going to say, but we'll see how we get on with that. So Nick's paper then, just very briefly, addresses the question of what role nuclear weapons play in world politics and how the Ukraine war fits into that. And the role of nuclear weapons in international relations is something that we've been thinking about for a long, long time, ever since the beginning of the nuclear age. And so in that sense, we are kind of now coming back to that same question again now in the light of the Ukraine to see whether that changes anything. And in a sense, what Laura's saying is, it doesn't change anything. And what Nick's saying is, well, all of what we see is a fundamental contestation, which I guess has been there from day one, really. If you go back to the very beginning and think about the letters that Einstein was writing, the correspondence between Truman and Attlee that I looked at when I was doing my PhD, is all about this idea that the nuclear weapons fundamentally transform international relations, and unless we get out of a world of sovereign states, we're all going to be dead. So, even Attlee, who then went on, of course, to take Britain into the nuclear weapons business in 1947, in 45 was writing these letters thinking about there needs to be a fundamental shift. So Nick set it out in terms of this fundamental opposition between, to use Gramscian terms, the hegemonic and the counter-hegemonic bloc. As Laura was saying, there can be no compromise between these positions. The battle lines are firmly drawn. For the nuclearists, the anti-nuclearists are fundamentally irresponsible in their approach. They should never be allowed anywhere near national security policy, and they're playing with fire in wanting to rid the world of weapons that nuclearists believe reduce the risks of all-out war, not just nuclear war, but all war. By contrast, the anti-nuclearists think that the nuclear-armed states are the ones who are literally playing with fire, and that the only responsible, morally compelling position is to disarm immediately, as required by the TPNW. Now, Nick's argument is that the Ukraine war has reproduced and indeed revitalized nuclearism, and this is part of a longer-term trend in global politics. He argues that nuclearism has found its starkest expression in Russia's nuclear euphoria, a symptom of this Manichean national identity, and he makes a very powerful link, I think, between Putin's claim that Russia faces an existential threat from Ukraine and the official nuclear doctrine. I think that's a really interesting point that you brought out. And Russia's nuclear euphoria and the nuclear threats it's made in relation to Ukraine often make evidence of a steady nuclearization of the East-West relationship. And Nick argues, I think, really interestingly as well, about this exceptionist framing that somehow Putin's nuclear threats are fundamentally illegitimate because they're made on behalf of a state that is fundamentally morally bankrupt and a predatory state. On the other hand, Western nuclear threats are legitimized as somehow acceptable because they're part of upholding the rules-based international order and so on. I think that's a really nice point about the way in which that Putin's nuclear threats are being framed in that way as somehow morally legitimate and different. And you want to say, no, actually, there's a moral equivalence between all nuclear threats, and that's the logic, I think, of nuclearism for you, and that's the fundamental legitimacy of any nuclear threat. And here you align yourself normatively, and of course there's no normative free zone, as Ken pointed out many, many years ago, when it comes to nuclear weapons, with anti-nuclearism, and then you deploy the arguments you went through in terms of how the anti-nuclearism position views the war in Ukraine. Okay, I want to make 3 responses. The first is that I want to suggest that you're operating with too homogenized a conception of nuclearism, that you're essentially engaging in an essentialist category here that we need to break down. Now, you know better than most, Nick, there's been a debate among strategists and decision makers since the advent of the nuclear age over whether nuclear weapons could be used for coercive purposes, or whether they're only credible when threatening as a deterrent to nuclear threats against the homeland of the state. Some nuclear strategists have argued that strategic superiority matters, and that important, it's his words, to have advantage at the utmost level of escalation is to have advantage at every other level. Such an argument, of course, is the antithesis of the idea that has been what Robert Jervis, sadly no longer with us, called a nuclear revolution, which is predicated on the idea that if states accept the condition of mutual assured destruction, MAD, of course, in the crazy acronym, then asymmetries in nuclear capabilities are irrelevant, and it's possible to be secure in the nuclear age without making others insecure. The opposite, of course, of the security dilemma. Thankfully, and this is where I worry that Putin's nuclear threats may mark a worrying break with the past crisis behavior on the part of the United States and the Soviet Union, especially, and Nick mentioned the Cuban Missile Crisis, which of course we mark the 60th anniversary of this year, was characterized by decision makers operating with Jervis's nuclear revolution thesis, that nuclear weapons conveyed no clear political or military advantage over an opponent who had invulnerable second strike nuclear forces. Contra Matt Kroenig's argument in the logic of American nuclear superiority, there is no evidence that the US possession of a 7-to-1 nuclear superiority over the Soviet Union emboldened Kennedy to manipulate the shared risks of nuclear conflict, political and military ends, or indeed that it intimidated Khrushchev into backing down and removing the missiles from Cuba. Now, the key question for me raised by Putin's nuclear threats is whether this pattern of past Soviet behavior is changing. Does Putin view nuclear weapons as psychological instruments of coercion that can be manipulated for purposes of intimidation and blackmail? Now, the point I'm trying to drive towards here is that possession of nuclear weapons does not immediately put you onto the railway track of nuclearism as defined by Nick. The nuclear revolution may not have shaped US and Soviet nuclear war planning and capabilities, as argued in recent important books by Green and Lieber and Press. However, I'm arguing that there is another version of nuclearism available to us, and that's not necessarily incompatible with strategies of reassurance pursued through arms control and other mechanisms of cooperative security. Nick talked rightly about the dangers of concentrating on the side of power in a single person at the top of a nuclear use authority chain. But we can also look to leaders to show restraint and the capacity for empathy, and indeed, dare I say it, trust, through a recognition of the moral imperatives to coexist in the nuclear age. This is what Kennedy and Khrushchev did in the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's true, and I agree with you on the historiography of the crisis, that what McNamara called dumb luck was very important. But as I've just argued in the recent article with Marcus Holmes in the European Journal of International Relations, a capacity for mutual empathy and indeed the growth of trust was critical to the way in which we got out of that crisis in one piece. It's that empathy and that trust that's been deeply lacking in the NATO-Russia relationship since the end of the Cold War, and which sets us on this path of renuclearization that we're talking about. In terms of the Ukraine crisis, the reluctant conclusion may be that reducing the risks of nuclear use depends on finding an off-ramp, that simultaneously does not reward Putin nor leave him humiliated or desperate. I would argue Putin and Russia have full security interests at stake in the crisis, and they will have to be acknowledged if there is to be any lasting settlement. Now, this is a key lesson for me from the peaceful ending of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Kennedy gave Khrushchev a clear way out, what Sun Tzu would call a golden bridge. And it was an important way out that was critical to ending the crisis. My second point quickly is I was a bit surprised, Nick, that you didn't mention the proliferation risks that we can expect to emerge out of the Ukraine war. Two basic problems here. First, the 1994 Budapest Agreement was instrumental in convincing the Ukrainian government to return Soviet nuclear forces to Russia. Of course, that's been shown to be a hollow agreement, and as a model for others to disarm, has clearly been found wanting. Relatedly, the lesson that potential proliferators and would-be aggressors will take from Putin's use of force and nuclear threats is that if you want to prevent such invasions against you, and they need only look, of course, at what happened to Gaddafi's Libya in this regard as well, you need your own nuclear weapons, because if you're facing a nuclear-armed adversary, don't expect others to ride to the rescue, because they will be deterred by the risks of nuclear escalation. And if this lesson is the one that some take from the crisis, it will be a successful case of nuclear blackmail with enormous and unpredictable consequences. Already, opinion polls in South Korea disturbingly are suggesting that South Koreans perceive the need to have their own nuclear weapons. And of course, the recent AUKUS trilateral security partnership between the US, UK, and Australia, whatever the non-proliferation promises and whatever the actual letter of the treaty, nevertheless, they open the door to the possibility of Australia using the highly enriched uranium in the submarine program to develop a weapons program. I'd be interested, Nick, to see how you see those proliferation risks playing out, especially in the Asia Pacific, and what that means for the battle between nuclearism and anti-nuclearism. My final point is to return to the contest between the hegemonic bloc of nuclearism and the counter-hegemonic bloc of anti-nuclearism. And I think Laura's point is a really powerful one, that everybody wants to avoid the ambivalence and drive to the certainties. And so the question then would be, what does it mean to live with the ambivalences? And it's interesting because in the work I'm doing now on trust, I'm trying to make this argument that the absence of trust is not necessarily distrust, and there's a space in the middle of ambivalence or neutrality between trust and distrust. And I was just trying to think as you were exploring this idea, how that might kind of play out here. Nick argues that the risks of nuclear detonations exist as long as nuclear weapons exist. A core proposition, as he says, repeated at the first member state party meeting at the PPNW a couple of weeks ago. But the problem here is that eliminating nuclear weapons does not necessarily eliminate the risk of nuclear use. This is because there is always, as long as nuclear knowledge exists, the possibility that the arsenals could be reintroduced in times of crisis, or that some will not even have disarmed in the first place. Point that many strategists have pointed to over the years, and of course the fundamental problem of the security dilemma, the anxiety and the uncertainty, the anxiety generated by the uncertainty about the intentions of others. As Ken Booth and I have argued in various places over the last few decades, the only basis for security at zero would be a world where states formed a global security community, in which the threat or the use of force has become delegitimized. Western Europe, of course, is the model here, but leaving aside the role of global war in making possible the European project in the first place, to state the requirement is, of course, to state the ambition. The question I want to pose in ending my remarks is, how does the counter-hegemonic bloc, in a sense it was what you were asking at the end, Nick, how does it subvert the citadel of nuclearism when the prospects for any of the existing nuclear-armed states relinquishing their arsenals seems to me as far away as ever? My response is that we need a more modest reformist approach. You would expect me to say that, given my English school roots, I suspect, that looks to how to reduce the risks of nuclear conflict by reducing the distrust that fuels the engine of contemporary nuclearism, and ultimately the building of trust between the possessors. But in the context of a highly distrusting set of relationships among the P5, a long-delayed NPT review conference next month that looks set to be mired in controversy and failure, the focus in both theory and practice needs to be on distrust dissolution and risk reduction. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. Nick, would you like to respond to Laura and Nick, or would you like to get more questions from him? A couple of quick responses.
So this is based on an article to be published in ABBA's International Relations, where, and I didn't go into it, I didn't unpack it all here because the focus would have been too much on that. But I kind of do a fourfold of to bring hegemony into this, of a hegemonic nuclearism and a subaltern nuclearism, and a hegemonic anti-nuclearism, and a subaltern anti-nuclearism. And what I was really speaking to was a hegemonic nuclearism and a subaltern anti-nuclearism. So it's not quite as binary. You might still think, well, actually, I'm still talking about binaries. But I think you're bringing up Issy Abraham's point on ambivalence is a really important one, because it does beg the question: what do we do with that if we can't escape it? I mean, it's like about, you know, what can we say concretely about nuclear deterrence? Lots of contradictory things all at once. So what can we say about what we know with any degree of certainty about nuclear risk? With any degree of certainty in any particular context, I don't think we can really say very much concretely at all. So what do we do with that? What do we do with this intrinsic ambivalence when the stakes are potentially so high? I don't have an answer to that, but it's a really, really important question. So yeah, bringing Issy Abraham's point in is really important. Nick, just to respond to a couple of things. So when I'm talking about this contestation, again, I didn't use the language of nuclear ontologies here, but that is the language that I use in this paper. And I use it specifically because the nuclear worldview that is constructed through particularly the TPNW, but it's got a much richer heritage like that than that. I think its most recent iteration before then was the transnational campaign to end explosive nuclear testing that led to the test ban, and particularly a lot of that coming out of the Pacific and out of Asia. I mean, this is a fundamentally different way of constituting nuclear politics and understanding what it means, that foregrounds violence, effects on the environment and the climate, foregrounds gender, foreground post-colonialism and so on, in lots of different ways, lots of different threads to this, that I argue is a fundamentally different nuclear ontology. So whereas what you're arguing, I think, is about different nuclear strategies within what I would call nuclearism. So nuclearism for me is at base an argument that nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence are of value, are necessary, important, whatever. Yeah, and I think you're talking about different strategies within that. So that's just to draw that distinction. And on the nuclear proliferation issue, I mean, it's an interesting one because this has been part of this kind of this speculative deluge of commentary from the nuclear community from February onwards, that Russia's actions have kind of blown up the nuclear order and will lead to proliferation and so on. Now it could do, but my understanding of the scholarship on nuclear proliferation says different things. That cases of proliferation don't tend to follow a kind of a neat linear history of reading clear security lessons off from structural imperatives highlighted by, in this instance, the collapse of the Budapest Memorandum and so on. Now for some countries it might, but we've seen this before following the Gulf War in 1990. I'm sure there are other instances, Gulf War in 1990, Libya and so on. And we don't see waves of proliferation following on because proliferation dynamics are about much, much more than this, I think. So I'm not sure I really buy into that. I mean, the South Korean issue, you know, there have been lots of public opinion polls following the serious nuclearization of North Korea that have ebbed and flowed depending on who's in power in the Blue House and who's not, about support for a South Korean nuclear capability. So I'm not sure about that. And in terms of kind of where we go with this, I mean, I don't know. This is one of the really disabling things about being involved in nuclear disarmament, because it's incredibly difficult, right? Because the power structures are almost entirely with living in a permanently nuclear armed world, whilst at the same time experiencing quite profound concern and fear about what that means over the long term. You know, I hope to have my kids to have kids and to be, you know, to have grandkids. So, you know, projecting forward maybe 60, 70, 80 years into their lifetimes, what does it mean to live in an ebbing and flowing nuclear armed world with people like Putin or Trump or Kim Jong-un at the helm and so on? You know, whilst at the same time accepting that there are deep power asymmetries that preclude you from much hope of dislodging that. I mean, it's profoundly disempowering on the one hand, And at the same time, there is hope in this sense of this contestation. And within that contestation, perhaps there are openings for new things to happen. I think the TPNW has been part of that. Whether we'll look back in 20 years and see that as having had any serious political effect, who knows? Odds are, probably not, but we don't know. We don't know. And that's part of the ambivalence and part of perhaps embracing ambivalence in a more optimistic sense. I'll stop there.
Grant, let's open it to the floor then. Yes, please.
My concern is in the whole range of the gap between policy makers and inside inflation. Very few people spend very much time thinking about that. So, you know, you share some fantastic but we think it's the way we develop.
Anyone wishes to strike around? All of you? Oh, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think the crux of the question is, are we in a situation when we're facing nuclear amnesia? In other words, there is a generation that has got experience with the Cold War. I'm hoping I'm not doing this injustice, that understood nuclear weapons fundamentally different than the next generation. Is that accurate? Okay. Would someone want to talk about nuclear amnesia? Laura?
I mean, I just have a because this, you know, I've, you know, thought about this before, and I think, you know, that's probably correct. The other point, though, I do always think when when this is brought up, is that those people who knew these weapons best ultimately built 70,000 of them. The generation that knew these weapons thought, we need more, we need plans for, you know, massive retaliation. So, you know, does familiarity in the way build a sort of restraint and knowledge, does that, you know, automatically equate to the level of restraint? And if we think back to the amount of near misses and the times that you know, we've really just been lucky in the past, I'm reluctant to think about this in a way of kind of, we need to go back to, you know, in the past they had, you know, some more knowledge, that some more literacy, because I think that was a dangerous age too. But I do think it's a really important point in thinking about how we can go forward, and how, I mean, I think this has really brought home to me how, as a scholar of these things, how as a teacher and educator, how we have such responsibilities to communicate this both upwards and publicly as well. And just very briefly, I mean, I had, when this happened, we had a community event at the University of Leeds with students, and, you know, I talked to students about this, and one of the questions I got was, because this was just after Putin had said that he was going to, I think, put Britain underwater. He was going to, you know, and one of the students in the audience was saying, well, you know, what protection do we have from these weapons? And I was like, well, none. And there was a kind of a reaction in the audience because the students didn't know this. So I do think that we have a very big responsibility to try and communicate this. But I don't know that I agree that thinking about the past as some sort of time when this was thought of more seriously is the best way to do that. Because, yeah, the past led us to the, you know, crazy spiraling arms race from the people who knew about this the most.
I also think there's a danger. It's a good question, but I also think there's a danger about romanticizing the past. You know, I think Nick made the point about historiography of the Cuban Missile Crisis. I mean, you know, I have a lot of respect for how John F. Kennedy handled that crisis. However, we shouldn't have been in that crisis in the first place. And without the existence of nuclear weapons, we wouldn't have been in that crisis. So, and the fact that the Kennedy administration decided to take the world to the brink of nuclear war to remove those missiles out of Cuba is, I think, something we need to sit back and just think about why that was. And in the end, you know, Khrushchev put those missiles in Cuba. I mean, Jen is in the audience. She may want to say something here, but you know, Khrushchev put those missiles in, and Caroline as well, of course. Khrushchev put those missiles in Cuba, arguably as a defensive move, because he was fearful of what the US was doing, that they were going to invade Cuba, but also the overall strategic nuclear position. So it came from a position, in a lot of ways, I think, from a defensive position. There was certainly an offensive motivation too. He wanted to improve his position over Berlin. It's always complicated in international relations. The motives are always intertwined, but we shouldn't underestimate, you know, how much there was fear at work in that and how close we came. And, you know, you think about other situations in the early 1980s, you know, when this crisis developed, you know, I've been sort of having a conversation with myself about, is this more dangerous than when I was a student, when I first met Ken in the early 1980s? You know, and that was a moment when leaders were not particularly restrained or careful, although we now know that actually they probably were a bit more restrained than we thought. And often this is one of the fundamental problems of studying nuclear issues, is that we need a lot more information decades later to really know. And that, you know, so today, how close are we? What are the risks? You know, we probably will know a lot more in 30 years' time than we know now. But I think we shouldn't romanticize the past. At the same time, I think we need to be, all the points Laura's made about the future is critical.
Yeah, thanks very much for your question. And I agree with everything that Laura and Nick have said, but I'll just add a couple of things. I think the disconnect between political leaders, as in, you know, the executive, the presidents, prime ministers, and so on, and nuclear strategy has been there, that disconnect. I think nuclear weapons choices have always been seen through a political lens in terms of electioneering or funding choices, opportunity cost, and things like that. And I can only speak from my experience of doing research on the UK nuclear weapons enterprise. particularly around the whole Trident replacement process. But thinking about nuclear deterrence is obviously taken extremely seriously within the Ministry of Defence, and not to come out in support of the Ministry of Defence at all, but just through personal experience, having interacted, spoken with, formally and many times informally, I find that those involved in thinking about nuclear weapons have often come through a career of having served in the submarine force. Do take these things seriously and think about them long and hard, and are also forever concerned and sometimes appalled about how little interest, how there is in the political leadership in these issues. So I think to a certain extent that's probably always been there. But there is lots of thinking going on about nuclear deterrence. I wouldn't say there's a kind of a nuclear amnesia, but it's changed considerably since the Cold War. I mean, looking at the ways in which nuclear weapons are now understood in an American concept of integrated deterrence, whereby you have a whole spectrum of operations, small scale conventional, cyber involving space assets, special operations forces, low yield, very small numbers of nuclear, all the way up to central nuclear exchange. This idea of integrated deterrence now is how nuclear deterrence is understood. Lots of thinking about that, much of which I personally find deeply worrisome. So that is there. And some senior leaderships do involve themselves in nuclear weapons thinking through tabletop exercises. And Fred Kaplan in his book on the bomb reported this under the Obama administration, where the principals and then their deputies did a couple of tabletop exercises on how they would respond to a Russian first use of nuclear weapons over something like Crimea. This is after Crimea had happened. The deputies decided to go down the path of sort of conventional response with some reassurance. The principals went all in and responded with nuclear weapons. We ended up in global nuclear war. So political leaderships do occasionally, maybe not at the level of a president, but at the next level below, do still, in this context, engage with some of the practicalities of nuclear politics and what, in particular, responses to some other states' nuclear use might look like. So I'm not sure there is that amnesia. Certainly different, and whether someone like Boris Johnson pays a blindest bit of notice, despite the fact that he would have had to write his letters of last resort right on his first day as Prime Minister. Beyond that, I doubt he's paid the slightest bit of notice, other than saying jingoistic things about being a big, strong, powerful nuclear power. But that's Boris Johnson. I think other leaders, Theresa May, I think, would probably have thought about it.
In the back there, and then yourself. Yes. I take it I need to repeat those. That's wonderful. Summarizing is what I do for my living. So I'm earning my keep here. I believe there is two questions here. One is there any implication to distinguishing between tactical and strategic nuclear weapons in the conflict in Ukraine? And the other is a more nuanced understanding of pathways towards proliferation. In other words, there might be different dynamics in different places, and these dynamics might be affected in various ways by what's been happening in Ukraine, but might be also completely unaffected by what's happening there. Oh, wow.
Very good.
I think the point to make on the speculation around scenarios for Russia's first use of nuclear weapons in this conflict is that, you know, a tactical nuclear weapon would, in Russia's arsenal, tactical nuclear weapons range from the very low kilotons through to 90 to 100 kilotons, about the size of a Trident warhead, with the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs exploding with yields of around 15 and 18 kilotons respectively. So there's still, you know, most of those are in the kind of 10 to 20 kiloton range in the Russian arsenal. So you're still talking massive levels of devastation from what is often misunderstood as sort of small scale nuclear violence. So yes, we have these labels of the tactical and the strategic and so on, but in the context of this conflict, I don't think they're particularly helpful. And these nuclear use scenarios don't really, for whether it's worth saying this or not, it's up to you to judge, I suppose. But these nuclear use scenarios don't really map onto the formal scenarios set out in Russian nuclear doctrine and reiterated, I think about a month ago, by Dmitry Medvedev, in terms of using tactical nuclear weapons to try and achieve some gain in a otherwise conventional and localized for Russia, I guess, conflict. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. Others might want to say something.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, there's two really interesting questions. I mean, I guess the question for me is, you know, what I was trying to pose was whether Putin is approaching nuclear weapons in a different way to how other leaders have approached them, in terms of believing actively that it can be instruments of coercion and intimidation, which is not what I think we've seen in the crisis behavior in the past. And obviously what people are worried about is the possibility that, I think, if Putin felt that he was losing really big, and this is, you know, I read a piece on this a few months ago saying that, you know, the most dangerous situation would be to humiliate Putin and put him into a position where he felt extremely desperate. That's the context in which I think you might see some kind of resort to nuclear weapons to try and then win big and change the game fundamentally by so intimidating the West into backing down. But it is, I mean, as Nick's saying, you know, these scenario spinning games that people engage in and war exercise, they've done lots of crisis game exercises over the years, both at the track 1 and the track 2 level, doing these kind of scenarios. But often what happens is, you know, when Russia escalates in that way, then they do end up with NATO not escalating sometimes, or it goes way, you know, there's a full scale escalation. So, I mean, this is why I think all three of us have articulated our kind of concerns around the crisis and, you know, the fears it's generated in us in different ways. You know, I think it's very unlikely, but, you know, coming back to Dennis Healy, you know, he used to say that, you know, as long as there's just a 1% chance in Russia's mind that NATO might use nuclear weapons, then that might stop them coming across the inner German border. You know, if there's a 1% increase in the risks of nuclear conflict, because in this situation, then that's something we should be very worried about, given the enormous consequences. But Nick's point about thinking about tactical as being, you know, something which is very manageable and very limited in its explosive capacity. Absolutely, these are very, very destructive weapons. And historically, you know, that threshold between tactical and strategic, a lot of people have argued it very quickly would get eroded. The whole nuclear revolution thesis is built on the idea that escalation will take place all the way up to the strategic nuclear level as soon as you begin actually fighting face to face, you know, that there will be this chain of escalation. Your other point is interesting. Just let me make a very quick response. I mean, the problem with all these discussions is that we've got to be careful that we don't sort of abstract them out of strategic context. So, you know, I would say if I was sitting in Beijing and I was advising, you know, the government, I would say that they're doing the right thing in building up their forces because they are facing an increasing US and allied threat to their capabilities. And this comes back to the point I was making about the mutual hostage relationship. The United States still hasn't accepted the idea that it should allow its cities to be exposed to Chinese nuclear missiles. It's still struggling with that. It struggled with the Russians in the 60s. Finally, it made a breakthrough, arguably in the early 70s, although a lot of the recent scholarship suggests it never really accepted it either. And that's because, and it comes back to your point about vulnerability, that's because these states know that they're massively exposed with the weapons of others, and they want to try and take themselves out of that condition of vulnerability. And so what China's doing is it's trying to hold those American cities hostage in the face of American ballistic missile defense developments, the development of very sophisticated non-nuclear weapons that can blur the threshold between the nuclear and the conventional by striking at Chinese nuclear forces, but using American conventional assets to do so. All of that is creating a lot of anxieties in Chinese strategic planning, in the thinking of Chinese strategic planners. It's leading them then to want to have this increase. But, you know, if you talk to American strategists who have been involved in government who are now outside, they'll tell you that, you know, the thinking is very much, we're not going to allow the Chinese to get into this position where they've got this assured destruction capability. I was thinking about, you know, Ford and so on. Yeah, okay. But so I think, and the danger is, of course, that if you get into those kind of competitions, then all of the risks that Nick's talking about in his paper of nuclear threats and so on becomes much more likely. What I was trying to say is that, you know, there's a different way of thinking about nuclear weapons. There's a way which isn't the anti-nuclearism position, but it might be a way of reducing nuclear risks by trying to think about them in terms of, you know, reassurance, arms control, so that you manage the risks, you try to develop some kind of order.
I mean, I don't have much to add, I think. Yeah. So, I mean, just to say, I guess that I think that in this context, I mean, my position is that given the political, the destruction, the escalatory effects of any use of nuclear weapons, there's no such thing as a tactical nuclear weapons use here.
There's a question here. I'm aware it's 5 o'clock. This was meant to run till 5. We did start 15 minutes late. Would the audience be willing to go 10 more minutes? That's a compromise devised by myself. So it's not 15-minute extension, but a 10-minute extension. Yeah, is that all right? So I'll take a question here, and then Ken has got a question. Anybody else? Okay. I'll exercise my role of a summarizer. I believe the first part of the remark was on the crucial nature of Nick's observation, how much the nuclear weapons and specific understanding of nuclear weapons has been written into Russian identity. I don't know if that requires a response. The other point will require a response from Professor Wheeler. But to summarize, I'll put it very nicely. We have a panel where we have got 2 anti-nuclearists, that is Nick and Laura, and a nuclearist, albeit one who tries to convince us that he's a moderate good one. Nick.
I'm not sure you're going to accept that identity. Yeah, no, it's a really interesting point you're making. Okay, it's very quickly. So I think what all this comes down to, right, is a question of intentions, fundamentally. So if we think that at the end of the day, the Russian state under Putin has malign intent, is using nuclear weapons to aggress and advance, then I think then a lot of my ideas about security dilemma sensibility, about trying to build trust, about moderation and reassurance need to be put in the box and left alone. And we need to go to a much more countervailing, tough deterrent strategy. I would completely accept that. The whole point about the security dilemma is that there's an uncertainty about the intentions of the other. Now, how you then resolve that, what you then have to do is you have to leave the state and you have to make some decisions, because you've got to decide whether to build submarines, aircraft carriers, or whether you're going to do, you know, Arctic Council, whatever you're going to do. You've got to make decisions. You can't just sit there and say we're going to do nothing. So at that point, you do what Ken and I call, you know, engage in resolving the dilemma of interpretation and response, and you then come up with a set of responses. Now, we may be right, we may be wrong. You know, in 1938, we knew what we should have done now, but we didn't do it at the time. Is this a 1938 situation? When I've been giving my lectures this term, you know, lots of my students have been saying, you know, you're too naive, Wheeler, you know, this is 1938, you've got to make your stand, you know. And I've been saying, yeah, all right. Well, I was thinking Munich, obviously. So, you know, but the question is it 1914 or is it 1962, which is the one that I'm going back to more and more? Because the point is that reassurance can be misplaced, empathy can be misplaced, and you can get into a lot of trouble. But the opposite of that is that you fail to recognize that actually there is a way, there is a path to reassurance that you're missing, and you can both make yourself secure without making the other insecure. And if you miss that path, you then risk getting yourself into very dangerous territory. So there are no risk-free futures. And ultimately, you never know whether you're right. And that's why in the end, you know, my move on that is to say, well, you need the leaders themselves, or, you know, the deputies or the principals, you need them to come to the kind of realization that they may be in these situations. And it's the same with the Chinese situation. You know, is it 38 or is it 62 or 14? And these are, we don't, none of us know. And and in 100 years time, we won't know for sure. Just as we don't know now about the First World War, you know, the historians still argue all the time. So you've got your take about what you think this is fundamentally about, and that may well be the right one. But all I'm saying is that, you know, we shouldn't necessarily rule out the possibility. Now, the tricky bit here is, just very quickly, is the question for me is whether Putin's Russia is what Kissinger called a revolutionary power. A revolutionary power is not one which is insecure, because that condition is inherent in a system of sovereign states coexisting in international anarchy. But can they be reassured? That's the question. But if Putin is beyond reassurance, if there is no path by which there can be any kind of accommodation, then I would worry whether he's also beyond deterrence. I mean, in 1914, they were beyond reassurance and they were also beyond deterrence. Now, maybe the crystal ball of nuclear weapons and the consequences of nuclear war is so powerful that, you know, that changes everything. That's always the argument of the nuclearists, but maybe it doesn't, you know. And I always love this line that Campbell Craig kind of introduced me to in his book, The Glimmer of a New Leviathan. You mentioned him a minute ago. You know, Martin Amis said the problem with nuclear deterrence isn't that it can't last out the necessary lifespan, which is between now and the death of the sun. So in that context, you know, we have to think really carefully about how we can reduce nuclear risks. And so I suppose that's kind of how I'd respond. You want to say something?
The answer, of course, is that Russia is a revolutionary state.
Right. It's beyond reassurance, but then is it also beyond deterrence?
But there's no evidence to suggest otherwise, no?
What, that's beyond deterrence?
Yeah. Ken.
Follow that.
Putin
you want me to summarize that, Ken? I think I can do. Professor Booth has just declared himself a gambler in the nuclear casino. At the same time, he declared that all of us are gamblers in nuclear casino, and I think that's a correct observation. His two questions, I think, or rather, two questions follow from his extensive comments. One is, are nuclear weapons in the hands of Russia a paper tiger that ought to be challenged? I think that's the first question for the panel. And the second is, if there is no challenge to this paper tiger, will we be ushered into a fundamentally new nuclear age? That is an age where a nuclear-backed territorial conquest is possible. Ken, is that an accurate summary? Well, that's what I do.
Okay, a couple of observations then on what you've set out, Ken. First of all, I think the premise of your argument is that the threshold for nuclear use is actually very high, much higher than is commonly articulated in the nuclear commentary that we've seen over the last couple of months. And therefore, there's some considerable political space for NATO forces to intervene much more directly in the Ukraine conflict and fight and kill Russian forces, safe in the knowledge that that won't then escalate anywhere near the possibility of nuclear use, even if the conflict might escalate further conventionally and perhaps territorially outside of Ukraine. I think that's what you're arguing. And therefore, we should have a much higher tolerance of the risk of escalation to nuclear war than we currently seem to, perhaps evidence most explicitly in Biden's, as I put it, sort of preemptive acceptance of being in a condition of being deterred because of fears of escalation to World War III. Okay. I mean, I can, first of all, personally, I can understand where you're coming from there in terms of the desire to get the war, perhaps, and this is mine, I'm not putting your words in your mouth, but to get the war ended in terms favorable to Ukraine and supported by the Ukrainian people, that result in a decisive conventional defeat of the Russian armed forces as quickly as possible, to end the violence as quickly as possible, without giving Putin a significant political win. That being said, I think Russia is way past having any sense of winning this. Whatever Putin and his government may end up claiming, whatever narrative they may develop, they are such a long way past any sense of winning this, that the idea that if NATO states, and it would only be NATO states, right, led by the Americans, the idea that if they don't do something more direct with their conventional forces, that could lead to some sort of decisive Russian win that would then shape the geopolitics of the era going forward. I'm not sure I buy that argument. I think we're past that possible future, and I'm all for thinking about, I suppose, nuclear weapons as paper tigers. And I go back to the comments that I made that you reiterated, that nuclear weapons aren't doing much at all for Russia in this conflict. And therefore the efficacy of nuclear deterrence and the utility of nuclear weapons, I think, has already been largely called out. And my questioning of the proliferation arguments that might flow from this, from Nick's question, I also have my doubts about. And I think, again, in that context, the efficacy of nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence have been called out. So in terms of ensuring a decisive military and therefore political loss for Russia by NATO intervening directly, I'm not sure direct NATO intervention is necessary for that. But I do think that there are significant risks of escalation, and that there is a chance, however small, and I'm in no better position than anyone else to put a figure on this, ratcheting up through Khan's 14 rungs pretty quickly, and of this sort of complex technical social system of interacting nuclear deterrence complexes escalating through interaction rapidly beyond anyone's real kind of comprehension and control. I think that is a risk. And for me personally, and this is where it does come down to personal judgment, I think, you have to weigh these things. And for me, the risk of engaging in that is too great for the projected or expected outcomes, which for me are already, fairly significantly banked with a severe Russian loss and a loss of Putin. So I think that's my response.
Excellent. Thanks, Nick. Nick Wheeler.
Do you want to Okay, that's fine. So first of all, Nick, I think Ken's saying exactly, though, that he thinks that this does show the political utility of nuclear weapons at the moment, and it's got to be stopped. No, I think that's what he's arguing, though. So I think the way you've just explained his position, where you ended up to say that, your argument is that it doesn't show the utility of nuclear weapons. I think Ken's worried it does, and that's why we've got to act militarily, as I understand it. So he's concerned about that. Okay, I want to make 3 points. The first is, yeah, I know. Hang on, you can sum up at the end. So I want to make 3 quick points by way of my final comments. First of all, I think the way Ken explained the difference between nuclear-backed territorial conquest, intimidation, coercion, as against the kind of complacency of MAD, he expressed it far better than I did. But that's what I was trying to say about nuclearism, that I know what you're saying, that nuclearism always involves a genocidal threat. I take all that. But but within that nuclearism, it's more than just nuclear strategy. I think it's actually a fundamental different approach to thinking about the role of nuclear weapons in international relations. And what I was trying to tease out essentially was a kind of English school sort of position, because it seems to me that what you've got essentially is what Martin White would call a kind of revolutionist approach to international relations with the counter-hegemonic bloc and so on. Then you've got the kind of nuclearism, which can be very much read as a kind of hard realist approach. And then I'm kind of sort of trying to position within this sort of English school, arms control, kind of limiting the risks. So I think that's kind of where I was pushing back on you a little bit, because I think there can be different nuclear futures, even within the idea that we maintain these genocidal killing machines. Although my comment to Mikhail was about saying, I don't believe for a moment this thing can go on indefinitely, but we are where we are. And the question is, what do we do today? And then that's the point back to you, Ken. So I'm with Nick on this. I don't think it's, I mean, the proliferation risks, I agree, Nick, are indeterminate. I mean, I was making an argument about something that I thought was worth bringing up, but I agree, there's lots of variables to be put in play to see what happens with these states. But the Asia Pacific is a worrying place, I think, increasingly, with Chinese power, as the point made at the back, changing a lot of calculations of a lot of people in terms of the credibility of US deterrence. So I'm with Nick, Ken, on the risks. I just think this is too dangerous. Once you start deploying the kind of forces you were talking to me 2 or 3 weeks ago on Zoom deploying, you're going to get a situation where the Russians are going to start striking at Western airfields with conventional forces. Yeah, well, but they're going to have all sorts. You cannot deploy the kind of force Ken's talking about into the Ukraine without taking out Russian air defense systems, without completely, an air suppression on that scale will mean killing a lot of Russians. Look, the superpowers had a golden rule that they pretty much stuck to during the Cold War. You never put Russians and Americans in the same firing line together, because it could all go very, very badly wrong very, very quickly. And they stuck to that pretty much 100%. No, he's advocating killing Russians with Americans. That's exactly what they didn't do from 45 to 89. So I think Nick's, but I think Nick's, I know. Yeah, well, you would be attacking Russians who are inside Ukraine. Yeah, well, you'd be killing people directly, and you're having to, and I remember when I went to General Sir Mike Jackson and I said, look, I've got this great strategy for what you should have used when you went into Kosovo. You should have gone in differently, not used air power. You should have gone in with ground forces in this way. And he said, we went in, he said, if we'd gone in with ground forces the way you're talking about it, he said, we'd have had to do all this suppression and killed thousands of people first. And I was like, really? Well, that's how they thought they would have to do it. So when you give the military these kind of jobs to do, they will do it in a way that I think would lead to a lot more killing than you're talking about, and escalation. And then on that, right, think about 1914. You've written about this many, many times. You know, how did we go from the assassination of the Austrian Archduke in Sarajevo to the global war? No one thought for a moment that this little crisis in the Balkans was going to do that. I mean, Sir Edward Grey was in his office. He didn't start writing that the lights are going out until several weeks later. You know, the escalatory train that happened in 1914, no one expected it. Well, you say that. And then finally, Ken, this is a bit of a cheap shot, but I'm going to do it. You have a page on strategy and ethnocentrism where you talk about the dangers of people not recognizing others, the red lines of others, the dangers of failing to enter into how others understand their red lines in relation to the chicken. You talk about, you know, what happens if they're driving on the other side of the road to us. And this is the point Nick makes really nicely in that line about the nuclear gamblers. We don't know ultimately how Putin would respond to what you're suggesting. Do you really want to take that chance? But then you're back to Keynes, we're all dead in the long run.
Okay, Laura.
Um,
Final word, and then we're up to,
I think this point, I think the point about the future danger reminds me a lot about the arguments against disarmament, which is that there may be some future danger that is worse, therefore we need to keep or escalate this current danger. And I think that this argument rests on a sense of control that I am not comfortable with. So I guess if we're all gamblers in the nuclear casino, I am a very low roller. So.
I like that.
Great. Thanks to Nick Ritchie for starting things off. Thanks to Nick Wheeler and Laura Considine for their comments and responses. Thanks to the audience. This is certainly to be continued tomorrow, so please join me in thanking the panelists.